Good afternoon. My name is Don Tantiplafel, and I'm the Associate Director of Academic Ventures and Engagement at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. At the start, please let me acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors tuned in this afternoon. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public. We thank you. It is my distinct honor and profound pleasure to welcome you to today's exciting event in our annual series, the Roosevelt Poetry Readings, which brings poets of recognized stature to the Institute. I'm especially gratified that today's reading and conversation will develop themes and reflections in a time when social, economic, and political instabilities may fruitfully orient our minds and creative spirits to perhaps profounder questions of finitude, connection, and even transcendence. I just alluded to our finite, disconnected, and admired selves. In that context, I'd like to mention the Institute's focus area on academic freedom and connecting across difference, which concerns political as well as geographic and social and economic disconnections that condition our lives as thinkers, knowers, learners, and creators. The most universal gulf or divide or disconnect I can imagine is the difference that characterizes our experiences embodied, mortal, finite, frail creatures who may harbor a spark of the divine or the timeless. Now, at the heart of this aim to connect across difference is Radcliffe's overarching commitment to supporting and sharing work that promotes innovative study, critical conversation, and greater equity. This reflects Radcliffe's bedrock commitment to interdisciplinary study and creative articulation, informed by an equally deep dedication to inclusion. We firmly believe that these approaches will generate valuable new insights into effective and equitable and emancipatory ways of addressing many present challenges, whether that be climate change or threats to intellectual and creative life, especially threats to the institutions and practices that support our intellectual and creative lives together. Today's Roosevelt poetry reading, to be given by our featured poet, Christian Wiman, followed by a conversation with Major Jackson, brings into focus the Institute's emphasis on spotlighting work at the timeless frontiers of the arts and humanities. Christian Wiman teaches at the Yale Divinity School and the Yale Institute of Sacred Music. He's a Clement-Muehl Professor of Communication Arts. His new poetry collection, The Dance, will be released in early July. Our discussant and moderator is Major Jackson, the Vanderbilt Chair in the Humanities at Vanderbilt University. His new edited anthology on poetry and our lives as cookers and eaters will be released in the fall of this year. A fuller list of our speakers' awards and publications, too long and impressive to recite here, is available via links on the Radcliffe website. Finally, on behalf of Professor Jackson, I encourage the audience here to use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time during the program. Please keep your questions concise so that we can explore as many topics as possible. It is now my pleasure to give the virtual floor to our Roosevelt poet, Professor Christian Wiman.
Thanks so much, Don. Thanks to the Harvard Radcliffe Institute for having me here today, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to begin with a poem from an earlier book. One of the great surprises of poems is how they can open up a dimension of your mind that you weren't aware of. This is a poem that began in great suffering and then changed by the end. One of the dangers of poetry is that they can ask something in your life. You can have a moment that seems to require something of you afterwards. This is called From a Window. Incurable and unbelieving in any truth but the truth of grieving, I saw a tree inside a tree rise kaleidoscopically as if the leaves had livelier ghosts. I pressed my face as close to the pain as I could get to watch that fitful, fluent spirit that seemed a single being, undefined, or countless beings of one mind, haul its strange cohesion beyond the limits of my vision over the house, heavenwards. Of course, I knew those leaves were birds. Of course, that old tree stood exactly as it had and would, but why should it seem fuller now? And though a man's mind might endow even a tree with some excess of life to which a man seems witness, that life is not the life of men. And that is where the joy came in. This next poem from the same book, Every Riven Thing, can be read in three ways. Um, One is an environmental poem, The Times Toxins. One, a poem, someone suffering from cancer. And then one, a poem about how we retain faith, however you want to think of faith. Simone Weil says that attention is the most essential element of faith, and that we rarely have the kind of attention that will make God present to us. When the time's toxins have seeped into every cell, and like a salted plot from which all rain, all green are gone, I and life are leached of meaning. Somehow a seed of belief sprouts the instant I acknowledge it. Little weedy, hardy, would-be greenness tugged upward by light, while deep within roots like talons are taking hold again of this our only earth. I translated a book of selected poems by Osip Mandelstam, the great Russian modernist poet. Did it with a friend of mine, Ilya Kaminsky, did it because he was such an inspiration. And I'm going to read the last poem in that book, which may have been the last poem that Mandelstam wrote. Mandelstam was one of the many people killed in Stalin's Great Purge, died in 1938. And on the last day we have anything from him, he actually wrote four poems. He didn't write any poems. He composed them in his head and then recited them to his wife, and she remembered them. They weren't written down until much later, and so there's all kinds of textual difficulties. But he knew he was coming to the end of his life, and this is what he managed to say. I'm very moved by a statement by Marilyn Robinson. She says it can be an astonishing thing to realize that the world is addressed to you. And the astonishing part of that is that the you is not plural, the you is singular. There are moments in our lives when it seems like the entire world, all of reality is addressed to us. And this is one of those moments for Osip Mandelstam. And I was alive. And I was alive in the blizzard of the blossoming pear. Myself I stood in the storm of the bird cherry tree. It was all leaf, life, and star shower, unerring, self-shattering power, and it was all aimed at me. What is this dire delight, flowering, fleeing, always earth? What is being? What is truth? Blossoms rupture and rapture the air, all hover and hammer, time intensified and time intolerable sweetness, raveling rot. It is now. It is not. It's a moment of consummate consciousness. We think of ourselves as being in the present tense, and we get all these injunctions to be in the present tense, but technically it's impossible. We live retroactively, retrospectively. Even an instant of sensation takes a minute to get to your brain. It's always now and not. This next poem is from another earlier book, Survival is a Style, and it's in a very different mode. It's called I Don't Want to Be a Spice Store. I don't want to be a spice store. I don't want to carry handcrafted Marseille soap or Sampa and yak butter or 3,000 varieties of wine. Half the shops here don't open till noon, and even the bookstores brined in charm. I want to be the one store that's open all night and has nothing but necessities. Something to get a fire going and something to put one out. A place where things stay frozen and a place where they are sweet. I want to hold within myself the possibility of plugging one's ears and easing one's eyes, superglue for ruptures that are, one would have thought, irreparable, a whole bevy of non-toxic solutions for everyday disasters. I want to wait brightly lit and with the patience I never had as a child for my father to find me open on Christmas morning in his last-ditch lone wolf drive for gifts. Light of the world pin light, bobblehead compass, fuzzy dice. I want to hum just a little with my own emptiness at 4 a.m., to have little bells above my door, to have a door. Another poem that came as a great surprise. Thought I was writing a funny poem about not being a spice store, and suddenly my father comes into the poem. It's quite true. Those are the kinds of Christmas gifts that I would get. Bobblehead compass or fuzzy dice, something like that, that he had picked up at the truck stop, the only place open. Next poem is from that same book, and the title is Meaning is Not Man's Gift to Reality, which is a quote from Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great Jewish theologian. It will help. Well, you'll see this on the page that mist and mist are homonyms that I use. The quotations come from the German poet Paul Celan, and Sonnenblumenbrat is simply a kind of German bread. Meaning is not man's gift to reality. Another morning of mist. How many do I have left? Another morning of mist. The habit of lack is hell to break. The German girl had a little black abyss between her two front teeth that flashed, if you can imagine blackness flashing, through everything she said. She said, pinning back her turbulent hair and cheerfully chewing English like a Sonnenblumenbrot, that she was tensed about the poetry in my class, since it comes, the little abyss, from the, how do you say, breath crystal of a language? There had been for both of us a boy, American, obviously, and Midwestern, I would guess, who raised his hand like a clean stalk of wheat and asked in a way that was already an answer, shouldn't an experience of God bring us, I don't know, peace? It rained while I was writing this. It rained and my father died, and it stopped and it rained, and I leaned down close to a flower for which I had no name, and it stopped, and my great great granddaughter tried to think what it might mean to pray, and it rained and it burned, and I found myself in front of faces talking less about connections than the seams between things, because it seems no matter the knowledge or vision, there is this need, this void, this mist. The poem is lonely, the poet says. It intends another, and it goes out toward her. You come downstairs wearing what you wear and moving as you move up to the glass beside me, where we see, mostly, what we do not see. Neighbors and playthings, tree limbs one tick past implicit. Even the sun's in trust. That's my wife at the end. I. 'd. 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 ' This next poem, I mean, it might be an interesting detail to learn how it was written. It's called The Dance, which is the title poem of my new collection. Every year we go to Tennessee for a family reunion, and the family consists of 100 Black people and the four of us in our family. It's too long of a story for me to tell right here. Major knows it because he's read my wife's book, which tells a story. She's a brilliant memoir called Holler, A Poet Among Patriots. Her name's Danielle Chapman. 2 years ago, I was at this, and a poem occurred to me or not a poem, the sounds occurred to me while all this was going on, and so I climbed into the bed of a pickup, it was blazing hot, and I wrote this poem. And my wife got mad at me because I vanished for a while to write this poem, but then she was happy when she saw it. The Dance. She wakes away a stage, the receding cheers, herself some indeterminate age, and it seemed known for something she hasn't done in 40 years. Distracted, she oversteeps the tea as she is prone, sits in the sunlit living room, minds a psalm. Noticing the English ivies dry and overgrown, salvages two lucky cuttings. Library, bank, the gas station, a long conversation with bright, unbowed Joan at the women's shelter, the unspoken word battered, seeming to pelt her like a stone. Home, a nap, tidying up. She spends an hour in an hour she spent at home the evening her mother passed. Considers past, the warm capillarial light in which she shone like she thought it. A maple leaf held up to sun, a long, unlonely moment before the day is done. The day is done. She is poured out like water, but still in bed, talks her daughter down on the telephone, then lies with half-shut eyes, stitching and unstitching all the presences threaded through alone, yielding to the slow dance of grace and circumstance, a pirouette of silhouette and solid bone. And the next poem is actually a series of poems. It has one title called The Education of the Poet. They're four very different poems. They stand by themselves, um, but all are bound up by ways of thinking of how I learned to become a poet. Although one's about my wife. Um, you don't really need to know anymore. I don't know if kids watch cartoons on Saturday mornings anymore, but when I was growing up, that was our great thrill to have the Saturday morning cartoons. But unfortunately, often in our house, there was a lot of tempest going on. There might have been a lot of other things going on at the same time. That's what this poem is about. Watching cartoons on a Saturday morning. Nothing more of love than to watch the bright beings spurt across the screen, their elastic lives, their unsad disasters, their obstinate glee. To press one's face close to theirs until the curse and hurl upstairs, cackle and razzmatazz and sink with the beak of a duck. Oh, what luck these creatures come of storm, these avatars of form and color and unconsciousness dying back to life with a laugh. Cuckoo wobble, tuba walk, boing boing and the whistling thribble. Closer and closer to the screen until even the credits mean just this flickering inconsequence, this everlasting present tense. Let face with the rake be struck. Let the schmuck tumble downstairs with a happy clash of cymbals. Ring the king's head in the dented pail. Let the lost child drop. Let gravity fail. And this last poem I will read before we move into conversation is called Balm. I tend to go a long period of time without writing poems, years without being able to write anything. And this was one of those times, and I had gone about a year without writing a poem, and I was having an email exchange with an old friend of mine, Kevin Young, and we've known each other since we were in our early 20s. And Kevin had a very busy life. He was head of the Smithsonian African American Museum at the time. He was, really busy. And then, but he just said, as an aside, the poems are a balm because he was writing poems amid that. And I went to bed that night and woke up in the middle of the night with a poem in my head that I hadn't after not having written anything. And and it was a combination of, I had mentioned a poem by Kevin that I had seen in our email. And so that's why he had responded. And in his poem, which is a poem about Keats, and he has the line, "The heart it hoards." So that's the epigraph to this. And balm, of course, means we think of it as peace or comfort, but it's where our word embalm comes from. So it's a preservative as well. The poems are a balm, the poet said, whose ear endured, besides the natural atrophy of any unearned gift, history, mastery, and all the mosquito demons of email and oil changes, underlings and overlords, afternoons of disappointment and self-taste too heavy and humid to move. Amid it all, the poet wrote, meaning loves, meaning deaths, meaning the lack of meaning infiltrating even heart and hoard, love and death. The poems are a balm, meaning in ancient days a substance fragrant, resinous, effective for a time against decay. Thank you. And now I'll introduce Major, bring him in, and we'll have a conversation.
Oh, fantastic, Christian. What an honor and pleasure to hear you read those poems, but even more to follow up, hopefully, with a conversation that will illumine some of what I heard and what I think is an immense achievement in this forthcoming book. So thank you. It's such a pleasure. And I have to say, we've been knowing each other for a long time, but I don't think we've been in the same room.
That's right.
And so I welcome this virtual room and this virtual gathering. And thank you all for coming. Um, I am caught with how much of your poems carry forward sonically in its drag, a way of existing that honors the spirit of working through and searching one's relationship to divine, much like your prose. I deeply admire how you have made faith a practical topic for your immense intellect and modeled what some might consider kind of warring impulses in themselves. So, my first question, believe it or not, takes us back 20 years ago when you were editor and you orchestrated this panel discussion between myself and Stephanie Burt and Daisy Freed and Emily Warren. And you asked us, does poetry have a social function? So 20 years later, I want to revise that question to ask you, does poetry have a spiritual function?
Yeah, what a great question. Um, Absolutely. I think it always has, but it may be particularly pressing at the moment. I think one of the um, great dangers that we all face is the elimination, eradication of individual consciousness.
Hmm.
Marianne Moore has that great line, there never was a war that was not inward. And I think the great war that we're facing right now is how do we maintain, protect our individual consciousness amid the onslaught of I don't even have to name it, but the way
Hmm.
our attention is frazzled, but also world events, the fears we have, the disputes we have.
Hmm.
Poetry, um, for me and for many people, has always been a way of doing that.
Hmm.
Very literally a means of survival. And um, and I mean, I've traveled the country now for all these years and met so many people who are outside of the poetry world, doing other careers, doing all kinds of things. And it's the same for them. They think they use poetry in that way too. And I wish more poets were aware of it, but some are. But it has a very great, a powerful spiritual function. In terms of sound, I only hear sound as a poem comes on. I hear the sound of the poem before I hear the words, and I hear I will often hear the whole form of the poem before I know what it's about. And the poem is in a process. It's very much like T.S. Eliot described it as a quasi-musical composition. I'm putting words together. I had a moment with an older poet um, not too long ago, and she was expressing lament that she had spent her whole life on words, and I thought it was sad, and I didn't really know what to say. Of course, I said, you know, you've written all these great poems. People know you've written all these great poems that, you know, but it didn't do any good. And but as I was driving away, I was thinking, well, that's not exactly what I've spent my life on. I've spent my life on sound,
Yeah.
and 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 I believe that the sound is a conduit to the divine. That there is something real there.
Mm-hmm.
I've
When
never quite
that's
gotten there, never
Yeah.
quite gotten to the end, but
Well, it's funny because that echoes one of the questions in the Q&A chat, and I definitely want to encourage folks who are here to ask a question. I'll see if I can get to it. But one of my poetic heroes compares the search for two words that sound like, i.e., rhyme, like the two hands coming together in prayer, which lends this kind of sacred search for meaning, which is something that you have taken up in your prose, but definitely in your poetry. But I was wondering, how do you explain to readers, particularly we are well beyond kind of postmodern and discussions of formalism, but how do you explain to young readers this sacred search, the work of rhyme and sound? Because for me, particularly with this volume, it's spherical. It goes beyond the actual search itself. There is a portal that happens, and I had I was passing around the manuscript so that I can hear it in other people's voices, coming out of other people's body. How do you explain to poets or readers who think passe?
you know, I don't have too much anymore. As you say, the argument has moved on.
Yeah.
I think it was always kind of an argument. I remember talking to Alicia Stallings, now the professor of poetry at Oxford and wonderful poet, years ago, 20 years ago, and asking her what she made about of all this. And she says, you know, no one cares about that outside the poetry world. No one cares. And she has, you know, made an enormous readership for herself, for her own work, by just sort of doggedly pursuing what people would call antiquated forms.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so in one sense, I think we've moved on. In another, um, I teach mostly graduate students, but I teach one undergraduate course at Yale, and you do have to teach them that poetry is for the ear. That is a hurdle that you have to get over. But the way to do that is to have them memorize a poem. And so that's the first thing we do, and it's the last thing we do. They have to memorize it and get it into their bodies and be able to get it out in front of other people. And that's basically all it takes. And then they start hearing it everywhere.
Right. You're in the my bright abyss. You articulate a restlessness, which, if there's one word that I would ascribe to you, is not just restlessness as an acute value of your intellect and the questions that you addressed, but you articulate a restlessness for poets and poetry that are not uh, engaged in the muck and seriousness of living. Not that you write it all off as the pursuit of ego, but a good deal of the work seems to stop at the self. Um, could you talk about how you yourself have arrived? And I know some of this having read quite a bit of your work, but poetry starts to take on a particular valence alongside your prose, which you don't give it up. You've had moments of blockages or time, but how do you shift back and forth between those two genres?
Well, the prose always comes out of the poetry. I
Mm,
have written prose because I've discovered something in the poems that I didn't understand, and then I would write the prose to try to make sense of it.
mm,
I mean, the poems are like an ice axe for me. They break something open, and then the prose is navigating the space that's been laid open. But I can write prose all the time, but I'm never blocked with prose. Uh, it's just a matter of will. Not always great, but,
mm,
it is a matter of will. Whereas with a poem, I can't will it. I can't will it at all. Um, I wish I could. But I would say, the poem I opened with, From a Window. I mean, what you're talking about is a distinction, the self-soul distinction is how I would describe it. But I'd always written poems that made me think that there was something other, and every poet will tell you that their poems, that their good ones, seem to come from someplace else, and that's the only way that religious faith survived in me for 20 years, was I was writing these things that were mysteries to me and seemed to open up other dimensions of experience, and it did not seem explicable by psychology.
mhm,
Um, and And then I had some hammer blows in life. I fell in love. I got sick. I got a different job. I had all kinds of things happen to me in life, and life will slap you around. Um, and it began to seem obvious to me that the discoveries that I was making in the poems, like that one, From a Window, required something of me
mhm,
afterwards. That it
mhm,
wasn't just a one-off revelation. I was meant to incorporate that revelation into life. Richard Wilbur has a wonderful poem about Saint Teresa, where she wonders if her visions are true, and it ends. Visions were true, which quickened her to run God's barefoot errands on the rocks of Spain beneath its beating sun, and lock the O of ecstasy within the tempered consonants of discipline. Unlock the O of ecstasy within the tempered consonants of discipline, which is a great way of thinking about it. I
Yeah.
think we're all given these moments in our lives, not just poets, but we're all given moments in our lives when we experience joy, or a moment when reality seems to look at us individually.
Mm,
And usually we just move on from them. But, what if we were to ask ourselves, what does that moment demand of me?
mm,
For me, it demanded a kind of commitment, and the poems changed. I mean, I can see it. I don't feel like I've changed enormously stylistically from beginning to end, but the poems acquired a different kind of urgency with my.
absolutely. Absolutely. An urgency that I also, another change I would say, God, I'm looking back on even my own career, but also yours, and thinking about how serious we took writing and poetry, which probably at times divorced us from joy. And one thing I do here in this volume, and maybe in previous volumes, but definitely in this volume, you're given to in the dance humor in ways in an abundance that felt freeing and balanced out the more salient questions about death and illness. And but some of your lines had me in stitches. So English, even her sneezes were polite, you say in one poem. You compare these brunch restaurants to sprouting everywhere now like opulent acne. Is that was that a self-conscious decision, or is that just part of your worldview and your how you've evolved as a writer?
Well, probably both. I do have a sense of humor. My wife and I crack each other up a lot,
Mm,
which is one of the great gifts of our marriage. Um, but I hope I've been able to bring more of myself into the poems. As you were saying, when you're a young writer, it can seem like suffering is the only authentic thing,
mm,
and or despair. Usually, that's not even suffering. You haven't suffered that much, most of us, but um, you lean towards despair. Light writes white is the famous phrase that gets attributed to all kinds of people. If everything's fine in your life, then you've only got a blank page. You've got to have some kind of tension or disturbance in order to create. Um, but I've learned that joy is its own kind of disturbance,
mhm,
um, and you can create out of that too. And also, I think humor is, I mean, obviously an important part of life, but I actually think humor has theological implications. It can there's um, a writer, Peter Berger, who says that it can bracket uh, tragedy. For the moment of the comic impulse, the tragic is bracketed, and and comedy wins. Like watching cartoons on a Saturday morning, where the house is going to hell, but for that moment, the
that's
comic
right.
wins.
That's right.
And and so yeah, and I'm drawn to poets that are able to bring in all of that, all of those elements. And it's strange to me some that haven't been. Like I love Seamus Heaney.
Mhm.
Few contemporary poets had more of an impact on me than Seamus Heaney, and but there's no humor in Heaney's work.
It's
there's
very
no
true.
humor. Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's strange because he was a funny guy, and he was like he had so many friends. He loved people. You can get the love for people, but the humor just doesn't come into his poems.
Mhm. In reading The Dance, I thought of particularly the poem The Philosopher's Fall. Um, I thought of the old battles between philosophy and poetry, and particularly Plato's corrupting nature of poetry. But in this poem, I see you taking aim at the ephemerality of philosophic thought, especially um, in a book and your previous books where there's more substantive lands that we can abide in, such as fate. But I also heard, do you remember this poem, Gravelly Run by
Oh yeah.
Archie
I,
Ammons?
I don't know.
That
Somehow it seems sufficient to, yeah, yeah.
that last line, stranger, hoist your burdens, get on down the road. And I hear some of that chastening in your own work. But Kierkegaard comes up. I was just thinking about your work as an extension of that long conversation.
Yeah, I love some of A.R. Emmons's poems. They're fantastic. I love that poem. I love The City Limits. I
Mm-hmm.
love the poem he wrote to Harold Bloom. Um, There's a number of them. Um, yeah, well, I am restless, as you say, and I what I aspire to is a kind of simplicity and clarity of being and thought, but it seems not to be my fate. And I would like to rest. You know,
Mhm.
Augustine says our hearts are restless until they rest in you.
Mhm.
It seems that I can't have that rest in God.
Mhm.
For me, it is all a turmoil, and I have never found any theological or philosophical articulation that is permanent for me. They're
Mhm.
they're they're transitory. They give me great insight. They've helped me enormously, and then they crumble underneath me.
Mhm. Mhm.
And and so I feel like I'm just sort of constantly running from one crumbling thing to the next.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm. Yeah, you even um, in my bright abyss take aim at the I won't say futility, but existentialist thought, and where Camus takes us. Um, there you seem to announce its limitations, but you don't absolve yourself of it as well. So I was happy to hear that. I'm gonna um, move to questions from the audience here in a second. But I was thinking, going back to poetry, I was thinking about, the old prophets went into the desert, right, to experience this kind of deep asceticism that would lead to some insight or to hear God. And I was thinking about the parallels to poetry and why it's such a fitting form for you, because I also see that, at least with this book, several things happening. One, you're casting yourself into the future at a particular time where you may not be with us. I hear love poems to Danielle, speaking to her from that subjective, or that that position in time. Your family, your friends. Am I misreading here? But it's a deeply personal book, The Dance, and I know that your struggles, which you've made kind of public, animate so much. But now I'm thinking about the other side, and curious if whether or not you were writing The Dance and curating this volume, thinking about our future, which we all share.
I mean, like anyone, I do. But I've had 20 years of living with this cancer and 13 treatments, and
Mm,
three of them last ditch, where I was dead, essentially dead on the table, and so I've been living with that sort of uncertainty for so long that it almost doesn't register now. Like it,
mm,
like a, uh, it almost just doesn't register. Like the
mm,
last time I would get bad news, and 3 years ago I had a experimental transplant, and um, at one point I got kicked off the trial, and in the past that would have just devastated me. I would have just, but I just went out and played with the dog. I didn't
mm,
even didn't even register. It
mm,
registers with my family. I mean, I'm in great health now, but that has always been. I have no fear of death. I do
mm,
fear the grief of my family. It's interesting what is personal and impersonal in poems. Like I would say that poem, The Dance, is completely personal. I don't know that. Well, I invented that person. I don't know this woman and who had this experience, and but I know women like her, and and I know of my own life, and those things are fused. It's a deeply personal poem to me about how do you deal with the suffering of your experience? How do you make it into something whole? And uh, I often I often find that that some of the most personal poems that I write, people wouldn't recognize
mm,
as from my life. They're inventions of other people or the imagination casting itself. I mean, maybe it's giving a protective, kind
mm,
of like a diving bell. You can go into an
mm,
experience deeper. Um,
mm,
But this book is it's yes, it is a personal book. It's basically everything I can do. I mean, it was 6 years since my last book. It may be maybe the last poems I'll write. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Haven't been any since.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I heard some Matthew Arnold in there at Dover Beach. There's a moment in one of the poems where when I said the desert, but the speaker goes to the lake um, in a time of fire, I think. Let me go to some of the questions in the chat. One person says, I remember you writing of the tension in Gerald Manley Hopkins between poetry and his spiritual life. Over those stretches when poems don't come to you, do you find spirituality flourishes in a different way than when you are writing poems?
Yes, I've had to learn different ways of feeling the presence of God.
Mm,
Because if it was just poetry, um, the my dry spells are too dry.
mm,
Uh, I still find poetry. I find it in what I read often. Like in other people's poems, I can experience them almost like my own sometimes.
mm.
Like they give me a lot, and I still read quite a lot of poetry.
Me and you both.
Yeah, I have
I
quite a
can't, I don't, I mean, sometimes I don't even see myself as a poet as much as more of a reader who's
yeah,
hungry for whatever wisdoms that can be found there. I'm
yeah,
sorry. Yeah, interrupt. Yeah.
yeah, and it's a very
Yeah.
particular kind of. It's not even. It's a very particular kind of wisdom because you can't translate it into wisdom a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
It's the experience itself that you're getting.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I still I rely on that quite a bit. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think I've always had a very antagonistic relationship with my own work. Like I've wanted not to be a poet at times, and and I don't like to. I don't give a lot of readings to tell you the truth, uh, um, and I find them a bit difficult. I'll probably go out and exercise a lot after this.
I have that line from I hear the noise of my own voice, that lull line and epilogue, you know.
Yeah.
Our friend David Yezi asks, he thanks you for the reading and conversation. Can you say a bit more about the connection between sound and divinity?
Well, I think,
Big question.
well, yeah, it's sort of what I said earlier. I think there is Kay Ryan has a wonderful poem. I can't quote it, but it's just called Tune. And she manages to contain all of existence in about 16 lines. And she does it with a pure piece of sound. And somehow what you feel is that she's articulating how we get these glimmers that come and then they vanish again and again without a hint, is how the poem ends. Um, this is the deep machine that powers the lamps of dreams and accounts for their bluish tint. How can something so grand and serene vanish again and again without a hint? That's how it ends. Um, and so she's articulating the thing itself, but then it's the sound that makes that so mysterious and magical. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
there is a tune of things that I think that uh, um, is consciousness and is God. That somehow those things are linked in sound. It's why music is, probably the most powerful art, if we're honest. That it gets to it most directly. But
Mm-hmm.
all poetry does aspire to the condition of music, as Ezra Pound taught us, um, uh, and so there's something there that I believe gets at the essence of experience and something beyond experience.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say any more than that. It's just a faith I have. It's a feeling that I have when it happens, and when I see it happen in the work of others. Um,
Yeah.
but I do. Well, gosh, I've staked my life on it. So,
Could you talk about, as Kara, how you think about the lived experience of the present and how it influences your writing, and which echoes someone else's question about is poetry a refuge from time, and did Eliot's poetry on time, probably thinking of the four quartets, influence or inspired you?
oh, Eliot was a huge influence on me when I was young. Um, yeah, just enormous. And it was the sound of the poems. And things he wrote about poetry are still so acute. I mean, they're just amazing. Although he had a almost a complete disjunct between the person who created it and the mind that thought about poetry. They seem to have been just broken apart. His prose is so carefully calculated and calibrated. It was clinical, and yet his poems are wild. Um, Everyday experience, I often feel oblivious in my life. Like I just go through my life and I'm fairly unconscious. I mean, my family would laugh if they point out the things that I don't notice. And I often find that I will be writing a poem about something um, which I hadn't even realized I'd noticed. Like I would have thought I was completely unconscious in this scene, and yet the poem makes me realize that something in me was paying deep attention. So there's some kind of split in that way. I have never understood the people say you have an experience and they'll say, oh, you should write a poem about that. And I
Mhm,
never understood that because I could never like sit down and write a poem about an experience like that, that one-to-one relation. It just doesn't work like that for me.
mhm,
You know?
mhm. Yeah, it's more of a entering into eyes wide open, ears open, rather than a translation of what we see or what we've experienced.
Yeah.
Um,
There's a
the
great
Yeah.
there's a great passage from Thomas De Quincey, and he's quoting. He presents it as a quote from Wordsworth, and they were out on a walk, and Wordsworth puts his ear to the railroad line because he wants to hear the train coming, and then he looks up and he says, and he has this visionary experience of everything becoming clear to him, and he realizes that what attention is for him is mostly a very productive inattention. That
Mhm,
he's focused on something that he's not, sort of not meant to be focused on, or not.
mhm,
It has no ulterior. He's just listening for this train coming, and
mhm,
suddenly his attention is opened up in another way.
mhm,
I
mhm.
find that's often the case with making art.
That's a great corollary to your sharing with us Simone Weil's attention as a sacred act. Uh, one of your one of your questions here has to do with translation, and we have someone who wants to know about the experience of translating. What did it do for your own poetry, and will you consider translating others?
I have
And if
done
you do, I would love to translate with you some Russian poetry.
I've done a fair number of other translations. I just haven't published them. I do them sometimes for myself, and
Mhm,
um, uh, that experience was monumental.
mhm,
I was sick. I met Ilya Kaminsky for the first time, and um, and he was the one who suggested. He said there was a kinship between my work and Mandelstam, and of course I didn't read Russian, so I couldn't hear it. Um, but I knew I didn't like the Mandelstam I read,
mhm.
and
Had you read Nadia's memoir?
not then,
Yeah.
not but then I read everything, and I worked with Ilya and this scholar from Northwestern that I hired, and that book just blew up. It was like crazy inspiration. I did that so quickly, and then Ilya wanted to do more, after like a year. And I tried to get back into it, and everything I wrote was wooden. I couldn't do it.
Mm,
It was
mm,
all, it was like
mm,
magic. And then it was just
mm,
gone. And
mm,
so I found that to be quite a mysterious experience,
mhm,
a, a sacred experience for me. Doing some of the other translations, I do it to get a sense of poems that I love. You know, I've translated from Rilke, and I've translated Akhmatova, um, and just because I sense that there's something there, but I don't quite. I mean, I don't feel confident. You know, I don't know these
mhm,
languages. I know Spanish,
mhm,
but I don't know these languages, and so it's just it's an exercise for me.
and it's a one that attunes us to even um, immense registers of experience,
Yeah,
because all of those poets have had lives that have taken them to the edge or taken us to the edge with them. I'm going to pause here and thank you once again, Christian, for the reading. And it was a pleasure reading the book, as it is all of your books. I wish I had requested Every Riven Thing, which is on my syllabus and a poem that I turn to as much as I turn to uh, Hopkins. So thank you, and it's my pleasure to turn the program back over to Don Tantiflafel.
thank you, Major. Great talk, great questions.
Thank you so much. To quote you, Chris, life is not the life of men. Amen, amen, I say. This concludes our program today. I want to thank Professor Chris Wyman for his evocative and powerful reading, and both Chris and also Professor Major Jackson for the illuminating conversation, and you, our audience, for these excellent questions. Today's program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week. For information about upcoming Radcliffe programs and to see videos of past events, please visit radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today, and take care.